When you hear the words romance anime, you probably have a pretty good idea of what to expect. A high school setting, a socially awkward protagonist, a couple of girls fighting over him, maybe there's even a love triangle, right? And eventually, after several seasons of misunderstandings, jealousy, and awkward conversations, someone finally gets together. And on the surface, Oregairu looks exactly like that. You have Hachiman, Yukino, and Yui being the love triangle, right? And it takes 3 seasons to fully resolve that. You have the romantic tension basically everywhere, and yet despite all of that, I don't really believe romance is the actual reason on what makes Oregairu so good. Because if Oregairu were simply a romance anime, there's a pretty good chance it wouldn't have become the series that so many people talk about years after finishing it. The romance is obviously important, but to me it's not really the point. Because underneath the love triangle, Oregairu is a story about something much more complicated. It's a story about loneliness, human connection, and a desire to find something genuine. And once you understand that, you start to realize that Oregairu was never really about Hachiman getting a girl. It was about Hachiman finally learning how to let someone into his life. Let's start with the obvious. Oregairu absolutely has romance. You can't talk about this series without actually talking about the love triangle, right? From the very beginning, the dynamic between these two characters creates what looks like a pretty standard love triangle. Yui clearly develops feelings for Hachiman, Hachiman develops a complicated relationship with Yukino, and Yukino herself slowly begins to realize just how important Hachiman has become to her. So naturally, you might assume the entire story is building towards one simple question: who is Hachiman going to end up with? And that's what makes Oregairu so interesting, because the further you get into the story, the less important the question becomes. Instead, the series starts asking something much more interesting. Why are these people so desperate to connect with each other in the first place? And that question brings us to our main protagonist, which is of course Hachiman. When we first meet Hachiman, he's not exactly someone who's desperately looking for love. Quite the opposite actually. Hachiman has essentially convinced himself that relationships aren't worth pursuing. He believes people are fundamentally dishonest, he believes social interaction is mostly fake, and most importantly, he's convinced himself that being alone is preferable to being hurt by other people. That's why his worldview is so important. Hachiman isn't simply an introvert, he's someone who has turned his loneliness into a philosophy. Instead of saying, "I'm lonely and I want friends," he says, "People are fake, so I don't need friends." And that's a massive difference, because if you believe that relationships are inherently fake, then you never have to risk being vulnerable. Hachiman, based on his philosophy, he never has to admit that he actually cares, nor does he ever have to deal with rejection, because he never gets himself in a spot where he's rejected in the first place. The problem is, Hachiman does actually care. He wants to be understood, he wants meaningful relationships, he wants someone who wants to genuinely know him as a person, he just doesn't know how to get there, and that's where the service club obviously comes in. The service club is probably the most important part of Oregairu because it forces Hachiman to interact with people that he doesn't really want to interact with in the first place. But more importantly, it forces him to confront his own worldview. Hachiman, Yukino, and Yui are all very different people, but underneath their personalities, they're actually dealing with similar problems. Hachiman isolates himself, Yukino tries to become completely independent, and Yui constantly tries to maintain harmony with the people around her. There are 3 different ways of dealing with the same fundamental problem: the fear of being rejected or hurt by other people. And that's why the relationship is so interesting. The service club slowly becomes the one place where there's 3 specific people can actually be themselves. At first, they don't really understand each other, but eventually they become some sort of the only people who actually kind of see through each other's personalities, right? And that is why Oregairu starts becoming much more than a romance anime. Because the question isn't, who does Hachiman like? The question becomes, can these 3 specific people actually be honest with each other and create a genuine relationship? One of the biggest misconceptions about Hachiman is that his self-sacrificing behavior is supposed to make him look cool. And yes, sometimes it probably does make him look cool. But Oregairu eventually, around maybe season 2, makes it very clear that Hachiman's methods are actually incredibly unhealthy. Whenever there's a problem, Hachiman finds a way to solve it by making himself the villain. He'll take the blame, he'll make people hate him, he'll destroy his own reputation, and he'll convince himself that it's worth it as long as everyone else gets what they want. At first, this seems admirable. Hachiman is willing to sacrifice himself for everyone else, but there's a problem. He's still avoiding genuine relationships. Because if Hachiman solves every problem by sacrificing himself, he never has to actually communicate. He doesn't have to tell people what he wants, he doesn't have to ask for help, and he doesn't have to risk someone rejecting the real him. He can just suffer alone and call it a solution, and eventually Hachiman realizes that this isn't what he actually wants. This is where the entire series begins to come together a little bit. The phrase something genuine is probably the most important concept in Oregairu. Hachiman wants something genuine because everything he experienced has made him suspicious of relationships. He doesn't want a fake friendship. He doesn't want people pretending to care. He doesn't want a relationship that exists simply because everyone is afraid of what will happen if they admit how they really feel. He wants something real, but here's the irony. Hachiman himself isn't being genuine. He's hiding behind sarcasm, he's hiding behind cynicism, he's hiding behind self-sacrifice. He wants other people to be honest with him, while constantly refusing to be honest with them. And that's what makes his character development so good. His journey isn't about becoming more confident, it's not about becoming popular, and it isn't even primarily about finding a girlfriend. It's about finally accepting that genuine relationships require vulnerability. You can't have something genuine while constantly protecting yourself from getting hurt. And then the something genuine part of Oregairu becomes so huge to the other two main characters in the show, being Yukino and Yui. And this is why the love triangle works so well. Yukino and Yui aren't simply two characters competing for Hachiman. They represent two different relationships with Hachiman. Yui is one of the first people who genuinely tries to reach out to Hachiman. She's kind to him, she accepts him, and she wants to preserve the relationship that the three of them have created. But Yui also struggles to be completely honest about what she wants because she knows that being honest could destroy the relationship. And then you have Yukino, right? Yukino and Hachiman understand each other in a way that very few characters do. They're both incredibly defensive, they're both intelligent, they're both terrible at expressing their emotions, and they're both afraid of depending on other people. And that's why their relationship isn't simply about romance. They challenge each other. Hachiman forces Yukino to acknowledge that she can't solve everything alone, and Yukino forces Hachiman to acknowledge that sacrificing himself isn't the same thing as helping people. Their relationship works because they have fundamentally understand each other's flaws, and eventually they become willing to be vulnerable with each other. This is probably the biggest reason why I don't think the romance is the true reason Oregairu is so good. Because Hachiman and Yukino becoming a couple isn't really the destination, it's just the result. Think about where Hachiman starts. He doesn't trust people, he doesn't believe relationships are genuine, he isolates himself, right? And then compared to where he ends up, he finds someone who he genuinely cares about, he admits that he needs her, he risks rejection, he allows himself to be vulnerable, and most importantly, he finally stops trying to solve everything himself. That's true character development. The romance works because we've spent so much time watching these two people learn how to understand each other. If Hachiman and Yukino simply got together halfway through season 1, their relationship wouldn't mean nearly as much. The reason their relationship feels satisfying is because of everything they've had happen before they could actually be together. The romance isn't what makes the relationship meaningful, their development is what makes the romance meaningful. And I think that's ultimately why Oregairu hits differently from a lot of other romance anime. A normal romance story might ask, will these two characters get together? Oregairu asks, can these people actually understand each other? And that is a much more difficult question, because getting into a relationship is easy compared to actually being genuine with the other person. You can say you like someone, you can go on dates, you can call yourself a couple, but none of that guarantees that the relationship is actually meaningful. Oregairu understands that. That's why so much of the series is about conversations that seem completely unrelated to romance. The characters aren't always talking about who they like. They're talking about friendship, expectations, loneliness, identity, the fear of rejection, and the uncomfortable feeling of realizing that the person you've been pretending to be isn't necessarily the person you want to remain. And that's what makes Oregairu feel so personal, because almost everyone understands what it's like to hide some part of themselves from other people. Maybe not the same extreme as Hachiman, but the feeling itself is universal, I believe. So, was Oregairu a romance anime? Technically. Absolutely, you could actually say. There is a romance, there is a love triangle, there are romantic relationships, and eventually Hachiman and Yukino do become a couple. But I think calling Oregairu just a romance anime misses the entire reason the story works, because the romance isn't really the foundation. The characters are the foundation. Oregairu isn't great because we spent 3 seasons wondering which girl Hachiman would choose. It's great because we spent 3 seasons watching 3 incredibly flawed people slowly realize what they actually want from each other. Hachiman wants something genuine. Yukino wanted to stop carrying everything alone. Yui wanted to hold on to a relationship that they actually had created. And eventually, all 3 had to confront the fact that being genuine sometimes means accepting that you might not get the outcome you want. And that's what makes the story hurt, but that's also what makes it so beautiful. Oregairu may look like a story about a guy choosing between 2 girls, but that's only the surface. At its core, it's a story about 3 lonely people trying to figure out how to genuinely connect with someone else. And that's why the romance works, because by the time Hachiman finally finds love, he has already learned something much more important. He learned how to be genuine. And maybe that's the real reason why Oregairu is so great. It isn't a romance story where the character development happens alongside the romance. It's a character story where the romance happens because of the character development. And that's why even after all these years, Oregairu still feels like much more than just another romance anime. Because the real thing Hachiman was searching for was never a girlfriend. It obviously was something genuine.